The Switch by Lynsay Sands. Performed by Fiona Hardingham. Chapter 1. Lord Ratcliffe drew his horse to a halt and stared at the spectacle being played out before him. A young lad in the clothes of the gentry was standing under the front window of an inn, staring up the skirts of a girl hanging out of a second-floor window. The lad seemed to be speaking to the lass as he tried to grab at her feet, but Ratcliffe was too far away to hear what was being said. Deciding that they were probably trying to run out on their bill, Ratcliffe started to urge his horse onto the stables, not really caring enough to get involved. But at that moment, the girl pushed herself off the ledge to dangle from her arms. Ratcliffe slowed and stopped again, amused. The boy caught the girl's ankles to keep her from slamming into the building, then stepped under her to offer his aid the rest of the way down. Unable to see what she was doing, the girl stepped on the lad's wig with one foot, setting it askew. She nearly lost her grip and tumbled backward to the ground when the obviously irate youth jerked her foot from his head to his shoulder. He then directed the other foot with about as much care. Ratcliffe chuckled under his breath as the woman suddenly dropped to sit on the boy's shoulders. Her skirts fell over the lad's head as she did, blinding him, and the shift in position unbalanced him enough so that he stumbled backward, then to the side as he fought to push the skirt out of his view. At this point, the woman clutched at his hair for balance, forgetting it was a wig. It lifted from his head with her hands, and her upper body swung backward. The lad, already off balance, tumbled backward with her. They both hit the ground with soft thuds, hidden briefly in the shadow of the inn. "Damn," Charlie muttered, staring up at the treetops above them until a pitiful moan from Beth stirred the cool night air. Sitting up, Charlie surveyed the prone girl with a worried frown. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth sighed at the question. Her moan had been one of chagrin, but the concerned face suddenly, leaning over her own, told her that it had been misconstrued. "Fine," she said dryly. She sat up to brush grass and dirt off her dress. Charlie started to help, but Beth waved the attempt away. "Your wig is gone," she pointed out. Sitting down, Charlie searched the shadows for the errant wig, then slapped it irritably against one leg to remove the grass clinging to it before slamming it back in place. "Is it straight?" Beth glanced up long enough to nod, then struggled to her feet. "Well, that wasn't so bad," Charlie murmured cheerfully, standing and moving to snatch up the bags they had thrown out the window before descending themselves. Beth turned sharply, mouth open to give her own opinion of the debacle, but caught the twinkle of laughter in the coal-black eyes that were so like her own. She relaxed, grinning back. "A ride in the park," she agreed, dryly. Laughing softly, Charlie handed her a bag, took the other one, and led the way to the stables. "Is he unconscious?" Beth murmured as they entered the tottering old building and spied the stable lad slumped in a corner against a bale of hay. The bottle they had given him was still clasped to his chest. "Seems to be. You did put the sleeping powder in there, did you not?" Beth nodded silently, but held her breath as her twin carefully approached the boy, then lifted his head and let it drop back to his chest. He didn't even stir. Shrugging, Charlie stepped back. "Out like a drunken sot." Her breath rushing out in relief, Beth moved quickly along the stools until she found the one where her mount had been settled for the night. Murmuring soothingly, she stepped inside to set about quickly saddling him, while Charlie did the same for the mount in the next stall. Several moments later, Beth was aware at once when her twin suddenly stiffened. Going still herself, she glanced up and about, her heart nearly freezing in her chest, at the sight of a figure in the shadows by the door. Charlie tossed her a warning look, then affected the accent of the servant class, and asked, "Something I can do for you, my lord?" One eyebrow rising at the boy's accent, Ratcliffe smiled slightly. "It is very bad manners to sneak out without paying one's bill, and stealing horses is a crime." Charlie stiffened, eyes shooting to Beth's face. The girl was as pale as the moon. Her expression panicked as their gazes met. Ratcliffe noted the silent exchange, and wished for better lighting in the stables. He'd bet a lot of money that the girl was a beauty. His eyes were straining to make out her features in the darkness when the lad spoke up again. "We're not stealing. The horses are ours." The false accent was gone, he noted absently, glancing at the boy. Obviously gentry, as he had suspected. "And your bill?" "Taken care of." Radcliffe raised one doubting eyebrow. "Then why not leave by the door like most people?" he asked, noting the couple again exchanging glances. Charlie was trying to decide just what to tell the Snoopy hitch in their plans when Beth suddenly moved out of the stall and into the stream of moonlight coming through the stable doors. Noting the look of appreciation that immediately entered the stranger's eyes, Charlie peered at the girl now too, curious to know what the man found so attractive. Beth was pretty enough. Straight nose, good teeth. Her eyes were her best feature, large and blue-black, while her hair was an unremarkable brown. All of which described Charlie as well, not surprising since they were twins, but it was doubtful that the man had noticed that fact yet. "We were forced to leave through the windows to escape my uncle," the girl said. Radcliffe arched an eyebrow. "Why would you need to escape your uncle?" Noting yet another exchange of glances between the young couple, Radcliffe smiled wryly. "Or need I ask?" "I beg your pardon," she murmured uncertainly. "You need not explain. 'Tis obvious you are about to head for Gretna Green." "Gretna Green?" Charlie could have kicked Beth for her look of astonishment. If the saying were true that everyone loved a lover, they might have had a better chance of the man not interfering in their escape plans. He'd obviously thought they were eloping. Instead of leaving him with that mistaken impression, however, Beth gestured toward Charlie. "Charlie is my twin." "Charles," Charlie corrected quickly, stepping forward to join her in the light. Beth blinked, then nodded slowly. "Aye, Charles is my twin brother." Radcliffe's eyebrows shot up as he looked the boy over. Except for the white wig, the two were identical. Well, of course, there were the obvious physical differences. Where the girl's chest was ample, the boy's was not. After his initial surprise had passed, Radcliffe's eyes narrowed with some suspicion. "Why would the two of you need to flee your uncle in the dead of night?" "Our parents died 4 years ago," the lad answered this time. "Our uncle took over our care. He has done his best to run the family estates into the ground, and now wishes to replenish his coffers by selling Beth off into marriage. To Lord Carland." Radcliffe stiffened at that name, shocked. Carland was a brutal bastard. He had been through 3 wives already. The first had died in childbirth. It was said that a beating had sent her into labour, and may have had something to do with her death as well. The second wife had killed herself. The third had plunged to her death down the stairs of the family's country estate. There was much speculation as to whether she had had some assistance from her husband in that plunge. Whatever the case, not one of his wives had lasted a year, and no one would ever consider allowing their daughter to marry the bastard now. But from this pair's description, their uncle was more concerned with his coffers than his kin. Were they telling the truth? "What are your names?" he asked abruptly. There was a pause as the two exchanged glances once again. "Charles and Elizabeth Westerly." Radcliffe searched his memory briefly, then nodded as he recalled having heard of Nora and Robert Westerly. Happy couple. They'd had twins, though he had thought they were girls. The family members had spent most of their time on their country estate and hadn't cared much for town life. The parents had died 4 years ago in a carriage accident. Robert's brother, Henry Westerly, had supposedly taken over the care of the twins and the running of the estates. There had been some rumours of late that he was running through the money quickly in gambling, and from what the boy had just said, he had, and intended to make it up by selling his niece into a marriage that would likely result in her death. Radcliffe wasn't at all surprised to hear that Carland was willing to pay for a bride. The man needed an heir, else his estate would be left to some distant nephew. His gaze slid over the girl and he sighed. She was a delicate little creature. Other than her over-endowed chest, she was thin to the point of frailty everywhere else. He did not think she would last a month with Carland. "Where are you going?" he asked, abruptly, gesturing impatiently when the boy stiffened at the question, suspicion tightening his mouth. "I'm not going to tell on you. I would not wish to see your lovely sister in Carlin's hands either. She would be dead in a week." There was no doubting his sincerity. There was loathing in the man's eyes, even as he said Carlin's name. Still, Charlie hesitated to tell him the truth, that they were going to stay with their cousin Ralphie, a relative on their mother's side that Uncle Henry did not know existed. Lies were the only alternative. Oddly enough, the plan that came tripping out wasn't half bad. "London." Radcliffe's eyebrows rose yet again. "Relatives there?" "No." "It takes money to live in London." Charlie grinned. "Uncle Henry went through our father's family fortune, but our mother turned her fortune into jewels years ago. She left them to us in her will." "And your uncle did not try to cash them in, or—" "He would have if he could have found them," the lad interrupted, smugly. "But he couldn't. Mother and father hid them years ago, in case of an emergency. Other than our parents, only Elizabeth and I knew where they were, and we conveniently forgot to mention that they had told us." Radcliffe's mouth quirked at that. Then he sobered. "He will find you in London." "Eventually," Charlie agreed. "But by then, Beth will be married off to someone in the ton." "And you?" "I shall be living well, off of investments made once I have sold my share of the jewels." Charlie lied nonchalantly. "You intend to give your sister a season by selling some of the jewels?" The boy nodded. Radcliffe frowned. "If you give her a season, your uncle shall hear about it and know where to find you." "As I said, eventually, but he will not look in London first. He shall head back to the family estates, then check with relatives on my father's side." "Why would he not look in London first?" "Because that is where he was taking us. He would hardly think we had run off in the middle of the night to beat him there." Radcliffe nodded at the sense in those words. Even Beth looked impressed with the reasoning, and Charlie grimaced at her slightly. She was supposed to already know of this plan. If she was not careful, Radcliffe would see it for the lie it was. "What of Carland?" Radcliffe asked. Charlie glanced toward the man. "Carland does not go to London. Most of the ton refuses him admittance. My uncle was taking us to London to purchase a trousseau for Beth. Then we were to continue on to Carland's estates." It was a sound plan, for the most part, Radcliffe decided. What the boy lacked in brawn, he more than made up for in brains, it seemed. However, there were weak points in every plan, and this one was no exception. For instance, if they planned on living off of a treasure of jewels, they obviously had the jewels with them, probably in the bags, he decided, remembering the way they had carried them, one each, two-handed, as if they were heavy. All it took was a highway robbery to turn them into paupers at their uncle's mercy again, and he would guess the foolish boy was unarmed. Aside from that, there were all sorts of complications that could arise in London. Theft, of course, or a jeweller could cheat them if they went to the wrong one, and that was only the start of it. Radcliffe tried to shrug away his growing concern for the pair, but it would not vanish. He would have to help them, he supposed, but couldn't for the life of him figure out why he felt the compulsion. His gaze rested on the girl briefly, but he mentally shook his head. No, it was not that he was enamored especially of this girl. Oddly enough, he suspected he was going to do it because of the boy. There was a certain stiffness to the lad that spoke of fear, pride and courage all mixed in together as he stood protectively by his sister. He was taking a lot on himself to rescue her, trying very hard to be a man, though Radcliffe doubted that the pair was more than 15 or 16. "You had best finish saddling up. Time is passing. You will wish to be far and away from here come the morning." With that, the man turned and left the stables. "Do you think he will tell?" Beth asked anxiously, as they listened to his fading footsteps. Shrugging, Charlie walked back into the stall to finish saddling the mount. "It doesn't matter. It might be good if he does, since the plan I gave him was a lie. But mount up quickly anyway. If he wakes everyone up, I do not wish to be here." Nodding, Beth hurried back to her mount, then giggled nervously. Where did you come up with those lies?" "They were not all lies," Charlie pointed out grimly, and Beth's smile faded. "No, the part about Uncle Henry losing all and trying to get it back through marriage was true enough. But I am not to marry Carland. I am to marry Seguin. Why?" "He would hardly be sympathetic to the fact that you are being married off to a fat old goat," Charlie pointed out dryly. "That happens every day. Carland is another kettle of fish altogether." "Aye. Besides, it was not really much of a lie, was it? After all, Uncle Henry was selling you in marriage to Carland," Beth murmured quietly, her gaze moving over her twin sister. She still found it a little startling to see her in men's clothes, especially with her breasts bound so tight they seemed non-existent. She wondered suddenly if it hurt Charlie to have them all squashed up like that. It had been Charlie's idea to dress as a man. A brother and sister travelling alone would not be noticed. Twin sisters travelling alone would have. She supposed they could have travelled as two boys, but Charlie had not mentioned the suggestion, and truth to tell, Beth had not even thought of it until now. Besides, twin brothers might have been just as memorable as twin sisters. Nay, she decided, 'twas better this way, she as herself, and Charlie masquerading as her brother. It was just the adventurous sort of thing Charlie liked to do. She was the braver, wilder of the two. Beth wasn't very adventurous at all. She was the sedate one, well-behaved, obedient, well-mannered. She did what was expected. Until she'd found out about Seguin. But she probably would have obediently married the great cow, if not for Charlie. Still, Charlie simply couldn't marry Carland. As the stranger had said, she'd be dead in a month, or in jail for killing him in self-defense. That's why Charlie had decided to run away to Cousin Ralph to seek protection. And where Charlie went, Beth followed. They were twins, after all. They'd never been separated in all their 20 years, or not as far as Beth could remember. "All set?" Beth glanced up at her sister's question, and nodded as she hooked the bag with her half of their mother's jewels onto the saddle. "Good. Let us go." Charlie led her horse out of his stall, and Beth followed suit, trailing her out at the stable. The pair walked their horses silently around the inn. Beth was staring at the darkened windows, wondering where the stranger had gone, when Charlie suddenly slowed and cursed. Glancing forward, she noted the man standing by a horse on the lane in front of the inn. "What do you think he is doing?" Charlie was silent for a moment, and sighed. "I suppose we shall have to ask to find out." Radcliffe smiled to himself as the pair approached. The girl wasn't bothering to hide her anxiety and confusion about his presence. The boy was hiding both staunchly behind a stiff exterior. "I have decided to travel with you to London," he announced, when they stopped before him, then nearly laughed at their blank expressions. They obviously hadn't thought to be so lucky. Deciding to give them a moment to recapture their thoughts so that they could thank him properly, he continued. "It is a 3-day journey from here to London. The way is littered with highwaymen and perils of every nature. Since I am headed that way anyway, I thought to avail you of my protection." Charlie glanced at Beth's nonplussed expression, her own face stiff with fury. Why the devil hadn't she considered that the oaf might decide to join them? Why did he even want to? The jolthead was going to ruin everything. She did not for one moment think that he really wanted to help. So, what was he after, she wondered. The answer came to her almost immediately. It wasn't that hard to figure out, really. She should not have mentioned the jewels. He must have realized that they carried them with them, and most likely he intended to rob them somewhere down the road. Straightening her shoulders, she glared at him coldly and announced, "Your offer is kind, I am sure, but I am quite capable of protecting my sister." Radcliffe frowned at the boy's reaction, then realized that he had pinched his male pride. The pride of young men was a most fragile thing, and while Radcliffe normally would have done his most to protect such tender feelings, now was not the time for it. Not when the boy's pride might very well see him and his sister dead. "You are not even carrying a weapon, lad," he pointed out sternly. "If I had been a thief, I could have killed you both and taken your jewels in the stables." Charlie blinked, wondering if the man had read her thoughts regarding his motives. then shrugged such worries aside. She had more important concerns, such as finding some way to refuse his offer and avoid raising his suspicions at the same time. "Who are you?" Radcliffe blinked. "What?" "Your name, Sirrah." He stiffened at the insulting address, then arched one eyebrow rather superciliously, and reached into his pocket to withdraw a small card, which he presented to Charlie. Stepping forward, she took the card and frowned as she read the name out loud. "Lord Jeremy William Richards, the Earl of Radcliffe." She looked up at him. "Lord Radcliffe?" He gave an ironic little bow, then relaxed as he saw the recognition on their faces and the way the brother and sister exchanged glances again. "You know the name?" "You knew our father," Charlie countered. "I never met him," Radcliffe corrected. "But we did correspond on occasion. We were partners in several ventures." Charlie nodded solemnly, and did not correct Radcliffe's polite phrasing. Partners was a bit of an ambitious word to use for the investors who threw in with Radcliffe. The man was a genius, according to what her father had always told her. He had the Midas touch. Any investment he had made paid back in at least triplicate. Everyone knew this, and everyone wished to invest with him. But he was a choosy fellow. Very few people were invited to invest with him, and if one was not invited, one did not invest. As for it being a partnership, there really was none. The investors often had no idea where their money went, and fewer still really cared so long as it paid off. Radcliffe did all the thinking in the investments. Those who invited along simply rode on the coattails of his genius. She turned the card over in her hand thoughtfully. Lord Radcliffe would hardly need the jewels they carried. While they were a small fortune, they were nothing compared to the wealth he enjoyed. "Why would you trouble yourself to help us?" Radcliffe raised an eyebrow at the blunt question. "As I said before, you are not even carrying a weapon, lad. But, if I am right, you are carrying your mother's jewels." He grinned when Charlie stiffened. "As I thought. One highwayman and the two of you are paupers at your uncle's mercy." Charlie winced considering that prospect, and Radcliffe's expression softened. "I am headed that way anyway. I see no harm in offering my company as a deterrent to thieves." Charlie hesitated a moment, then grabbed Beth's hand and urged her a safe distance away, dragging their horses behind them. "What are we going to do?" Beth hissed as Charlie stopped and faced her. "We go with him." "What? But—" "He's right, Beth. We could be robbed on the road. I did not think of taking a pistol." Sighing, she shrugged. "He is protection. It is one thing to go to Ralphie with our inheritance. It would be quite another to show up penniless." "But he is heading the wrong way," Beth pointed out after a hesitation. "I know," Charlie thought for a moment, then grinned suddenly. "That might be to our advantage, though. As I pointed out earlier, our uncle will hardly look in London, or even in that direction for us." A soft laugh slipped from her lips. "We shall go that way with Radcliffe. Then, when he stops to rest, I shall steal his pistol, and we will head for Ralphie's." Beth looked uncertain. "But Charlie, he is offering to help. I cannot like the idea of stealing his pistol as repayment. I shall leave him one of Mother's bracelets. That should pay for the pistol 3 times over." Her gaze slid back to the man in question. "He must have been on the road most of the day and this evening. He shall probably stop at the next inn, or the one after. There we will make our escape, and that will give us most of the night to travel." Chapter 2. Nothing in life is simple. Charlie came to that conclusion as the first faint fingers of dawn began to streak the sky. She had expected Radcliffe to lead them to the next inn and stop for the night. Instead, they had passed more inns than she would wish to count, and they were still on the road. Glancing at her sister, Charlie frowned and reached out to touch her arm gently. Beth had nodded off and was in great peril of tumbling from her horse. At Charlie's touch, she snapped awake and peered wearily around. Charlie offered her a sympathetic smile, then turned to glare at the back of the man riding in front of them. They had ridden through the night without incident, not even catching sight of anyone on the road, let alone being confronted by highwaymen or ne'er-do-wells. Charlie was beginning to think that all that talk of the perils of the road was just a bunch of bunk, and that they should have conked the great goon over the head and set out in the direction they had originally intended, pistol or no. Now she was not sure what to do. The horses were fair done in from a whole day and night's travel, and Charlie herself was having some difficulty staying awake in the saddle. Add to that the fact that they had now added an extra day's travels to their journey, and she fairly wanted to gnash her teeth in frustration. When her mount suddenly drew to a halt, Charlie blinked and stopped glaring at the person she held wholly responsible for her misery, then peered about. Her eyes widened when she saw that they had turned a bend in the road and were now halted in front of an inn. "We shall stop here to rest," Radcliffe dismounted, wincing. He, too, must be feeling the stiffness in his legs and seat that Charlie was. He unhitched his travelling bag and walked to the horse where Beth sat half asleep in the saddle. When she merely stared down at him in a kind of exhausted stupor, Radcliffe's features softened. "Come along, little girl," he said gently, holding up his arms to assist her. "We shall have you tucked up in a nice warm bed in no time." Beth roused herself enough to slide off of her mount, but gave a startled cry as her legs collapsed beneath her. Charlie moved forward, but her sister's fall was forestalled when Radcliffe caught the girl in his arms. "See to the horses, Charles," he ordered, turning away. "I shall rent 2 rooms and see your sister settled in." "See to the horses, Charles," Charlie mimicked irritably as she watched the man carry her sister away. Sighing as they disappeared into the inn, she slid off her own mount, then gasped and gripped the saddle grimly as her own legs played her false. Leaning against her horse, she waited as the pain and weakness slowly ebbed, then took a shaky step away. Much to her relief, her legs held this time. Letting her breath out on a sigh, she grabbed up the reins of all 3 horses and led them toward the stable beside the inn at a hobbling gait. "His lordship said you'd be needing me help." Giving a start at those words, Charlie paused at the door of the stables and glanced back to see a boy approaching. He was no older than 12. His hair was rumpled and his clothes a bit dishevelled. It was obvious he had just awoken, and Charlie was briefly swamped with envy until she realized that the sooner she finished with the horses, the sooner she could rest as well. Offering him a weary smile, she handed over the reins of Radcliffe's mount, then led her own and Beth's mounts into the stables. She deposited Beth's horse in one stall, pausing long enough to unhook the bag of jewels from the saddle horn. It dropped to the ground with a crash, and she grimaced as she grabbed the handle in both hands and staggered out of the stall with it. Depositing it in the next stall, she then led her own mount into it and quickly unhooked the bag he carried as well. She then turned her attention to unsaddling him. She watched the stable boy out of the corner of her eye as she worked. He was quick and efficient, unsaddling, brushing down, watering, and feeding Radcliffe's mount, all before Charlie had even finished brushing down the first horse. Of course, she was so tired, she was clumsy and slow. She excused herself. When the boy finished with Radcliffe's mount and then moved on to Beth's beast, Charlie sighed with relief that it would not be her chore. As it was, the boy finished tending the second horse just as she finished her own. Charlie bent then to grab up both her and Beth's bags, but groaned at their combined weight and let them drop. She could not carry them both. She simply could not. Charlie was considering simply sinking to sleep in the straw with the bags as pillows, when the boy approached her again. "Need a hand, my lord?" Glancing up at those words, she sighed her defeat. "What is your name?" "Will Sumner." "Well, Will Sumner, truth to tell, I am all in just now, and I would appreciate a hand." Grinning at the thought of the tip to come, he stepped into the stall and hefted one of the bags, eyes widening in shock at the weight of it. "Cool! What have you got in here, my lord? Rocks?" "Basically," Charlie muttered dryly, hefting the second bag and leading the way out of the stables. Will followed her into the inn, waited patiently as she got directions, then followed her upstairs to the room the innkeeper had given her sister. At the door to Beth's room, Charlie set down her bag and dug 2 coins out of her pocket. "Just set that down there, Will," she murmured, holding out the coins. "And I thank you for your help." Eyes widening at the generous tip, the boy thanked her brightly and disappeared back the way they had come. Charlie then opened the door before her, glancing at the bed where her sister lay in exhausted slumber. Sighing in pleasure at the thought of herself sleeping, she bent to pick up one of the bags. She was straightening with it in hand when the door to the neighbouring room opened and Lord Radcliffe peered out. "Ah, there you are. I was just coming to look for you." Stepping to Charlie's side, he picked up the other bag and turned away. "Come along. The innkeeper directed you to the wrong door. Our room is this one." "Our room?" The words echoed through Charlie's brain like the crack of thunder. She stared at Radcliffe's back blankly for a moment, then followed him, slowly, into his chamber. "Ours?" Radcliffe dropped the bag and pushed it under the bed with one foot, then turned to face Charles, who still stood, bemused, in the doorway. "Come in and close the door, lad. No need to hang about in the hall." Charlie watched as Radcliffe slipped out of his frock coat, then set it aside. The man then glanced at the bed as he set to work at the buttons of his waistcoat. "You can have whichever side you want. I'm not fussy. The innkeeper's wife is bringing up something for you to eat. Your sister and I ate while they fixed the rooms." Tugging his waistcoat off, Radcliffe laid it over a chair, then sat on the bed to work on his jackboots. Charlie froze, staring rather blankly at the man stripping before her. Who expected to share a bed with Charles Westerly, brother of Elizabeth Westerly? Which, of course, was only sensible. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The woman got 1 room, the men the other. "Only I am not a man," Charlie screamed silently. A discreet cough behind her got Charlie's attention, and she glanced over her shoulder to see a short little woman behind her, balancing a tray in her hands. "Let her in, lad," Radcliffe ordered irritably, and Charlie stepped automatically into the room to let the woman pass. The innkeeper's wife smiled briefly as she walked over to set the tray on a table in front of the fireplace, then smiled once more as she silently left the room. Charlie heard the door click shut, but her attention was now fixed on the tray of food. When her stomach rumbled loudly, announcing its hunger, she gave up her position by the door, dropped her bag on the floor, and hurried over to the table. Out of the corner of her eye, Charlie saw Radcliffe smile wryly to himself as she dropped into a chair and attacked the bread and cheese the woman had brought. Even as ravenous as she was, Charlie felt compelled to watch Radcliffe move about. Shaking his head, he set his boots aside, then moved over to grab up the bag she had thoughtlessly dropped by the door, where anyone might reach in and grab it. Carrying it back to the bed, Radcliffe slid it under, next to the other one, then straightened himself and set to work on doffing his clothing. Charlie, froze in her seat by the fireplace, her hand holding a hunk of cheese, paused halfway to her mouth as Radcliffe shrugged out of his shirt. The morning sun was still only half visible as it crept up behind the trees outside the window. The room was still dim, the fire in the fireplace the only light from inside the room, but Charlie's shock quickly gave way to fascination as she watched the firelight reflect off Radcliffe's arms and chest. The man really was quite beautiful, she realized with surprise, watching the ripple and play of muscles in his arms and across his chest as he worked the buttons of his breeches. But then they dropped to the floor, and Charlie's eyes became round saucers of shock again, before she jerked her face away, several shades brighter. God's fish! She could not sleep with this man. It was not proper, whether he thought her a boy or not. Her rustling sound drew her gaze reluctantly back to him. He had turned his back to her and was slipping a nightshirt over his head. Charlie had a lovely view of firm buttocks and nicely shaped legs before the nightshirt dropped into place. Then Radcliffe turned back toward her. Charlie's gaze shot studiously back to her plate. "Almost done?" he asked, stretching tiredly. Charlie nodded, gaze fixed grimly on the food before her. "Any preference as to which side to sleep on?" She shook her head. "All right, then. Good night." There was the rustle of bedsheets, then silence. Charlie hesitated, then glanced up. Radcliffe was settled comfortably beneath the covers, well on his way to sleep. Breath slipping through her teeth, she sank back in her seat with a sigh. She was not hungry anymore, and now that she had satisfied the worst of her hunger, exhaustion was creeping over her again. Yawning, she rested her chin wearily in her hand and tried to think what to do. She could hardly sleep here with him. On the other hand, she could not think of a single excuse for why she could not, that he might accept. And she was so tired. Her gaze slid to the bed again, and she sighed. After 24 hours without sleep, it was looking pretty inviting, even with Radcliffe in it. Pushing herself away from the table, Charlie stumbled to the bed and stared down. It was a rather large bed. Very large. Lots of room. Why, she bet she could sleep in it quite easily without ever touching Radcliffe. Aye, she'd just sleep on top of the sheet, she decided, pulling the cover aside and slipping carefully beneath it. She'd sleep fully clothed, too. On top of the sheets and fully clothed. 'Twas proper enough. Radcliffe was already up when Charlie awoke. He had donned his breeches and was just finishing washing out of the basin by the fireplace. Charlie watched the play of muscles in his back for a minute, then sat up, reaching up to check that her wig was still on straight. She probably would not have even thought to check it, if it were not for the fact that her head was itchy. After so many hours of wearing it, the damn wig was becoming almost painful, as was the binding around her chest, she realized, reaching down to scratch at that now, too. "You are awake?" Giving up her efforts to scratch the bound flesh of her chest through her clothes, Charlie glanced up to see Radcliffe watching her as he donned his shirt. She stared back, taking in his facial features with some interest. Most of the time, since they had met, had been spent in near or complete darkness. She really had only managed to catch a glimpse of his shadowed face here and there. Even last night, well, early this morning, she supposed, in this room, the light had been dim, not lending itself to a true view of his features. She was interested to note now that he was quite an attractive man. His eyes were a rather striking pale grey and shone with intelligence, and what appeared to be good humour this day. His nose was straight, if a bit hawkish, and his lips were neither generous nor overly thin. His hair was dark, so dark as to be black, and fell off his face in short waves. He was not nearly as old as she had assumed the night before, and that made her frown somewhat as she slid her feet off the bed. "You fell asleep in your clothes." He seemed more amused than surprised. Shrugging, Charlie stood, wincing as her muscles complained of the night's activities. She was not used to such long hours of riding. "We packed no clothes. There was no room, what with the jewels," she said, by way of explanation, moving up to the second basin of water and washing her face. I shall lend you a nightshirt for tonight, then," Radcliffe proclaimed, moving over to collect his boots from the side of the bed. Charlie didn't respond to the offer. She had no intention of being there to accept it. If she was right, Radcliffe would decide not to travel today. It was already mid to late afternoon, by her guess, and there was no real need to set out before the next morning. It was safer to travel during the day anyway, or so he had said. Tonight, once he was asleep, she would take his pistol, Beth and the bags, and they would head for Ralphie's. "We shall stay here tonight and set out in the morning," Radcliffe suddenly announced, verifying her thoughts. When Charlie's only answer was a quick nod as she dried her face, Radcliffe did not bother to explain further. A light tapping came at the door. Charlie glanced at Radcliffe, then walked over to open it and find Beth standing there. The concerned expression on her face gave way to relief the minute she saw her sister. Stepping into the hall, Charlie closed the door and urged Beth back toward her own room. "The innkeeper's wife said that you two had shared a room," Beth whispered with concern as they went inside. "It would have looked odd if I had not." "Aye, but I slept fully clothed," Charlie quickly assured her. "And on top of the linens." Beth nodded, but bit her lip. "What are we going to do now?" "Radcliffe plans on staying here until tomorrow. We shall leave in the middle of the night, like last night." "Not through the window again." Beth did not even try to hide her distress at the idea. Charlie sighed and shook her head. "Nay, we shall try the stairs this time." "When?" "I shall come for you as soon as he is asleep. Why do you not try to get some more rest? It is going to be a long night." She waited until Beth had moved to the bed, then slipped back out into the hall as Radcliffe left the room they had shared. "Is she all right?" he asked, with concern. "She seemed a bit pale." Charlie shrugged. "She did not sleep very well last night, worrying too much. I told her to get more rest." Nodding, Radcliffe started down the stairs, Charlie right behind him. "She is very much like my sister," he said suddenly, bringing Charlie's gaze to curiously study his own. What is her name?" He was silent for a moment, his expression brooding. Then he shrugged. "Mary." "Is she married?" "She was." "Was?" "Still is, I guess, but she and her husband are both dead." Charlie remained silent as she followed him into the inn's tavern. Once they were seated at a table, she glanced at his face. He looked as hard as granite now, not in the least approachable. No doubt he used that expression to let people know that no more questions were wished. With this realization, she began to relax for the first time since meeting this man. She felt some of her discomfort slip away, and some control return. It was only then that she realized that she had felt slightly out of control since the man had crept up on her and Beth in the stables. It had been a strange and uncomfortable sensation for her. But as she realized just how human Lord Jeremy Radcliffe was, she felt some control return. It was an odd thing about her and Beth. They looked alike, talked alike, and even shared a lot of tastes. But each of them had a different sort of talent when it came to dealing with people. Beth was good with handling illnesses of the body. She could look at a person, know what was physically ailing them, and what to give them to help. She had a certain flair for healing a body. Charlie, on the other hand, had an instinct for people's motivations. She knew the pain they felt and what they needed to talk about. She could also tell when someone was hiding their true self. She'd taken an instant dislike to Uncle Henry, for instance, despite his seemingly kind and gentle nature when he had first arrived after their parents' death. Beth had been blinded by his facade and been taken in by him until he had started to show his true self. And while Beth had been terribly hurt to find Charlie's instincts proven true about the man, Charlie hadn't been surprised at all. Now that instinct was attuned to Lord Radcliffe, and what she was sensing was that he never talked about his sister or her death, and he needed to. Her tone nonchalant, she asked, "How did they die?" Radcliffe's face darkened. For a moment she thought he might tell her to go to hell and mind her own business. But then he answered, the words tumbling out as if they had been waiting a long time to escape. "They had come to visit me. They lived on the next estate and had ridden over on horseback for the day. A highwayman had been working the area, but no one had been hurt yet, just robbed. Petty thefts, really. My sister and her husband stayed for dinner. It was dark when they left. I suggested I have my carriage take them back." He paused. Something flickered over his face. Regret, pain, anger. "I should have insisted." Guilt. Charlie sat back with a sigh, positive that it was guilt that Lord Radcliffe felt when he spoke of his sister. "But why? Was she younger than you?" "Aye," he sighed and drank from his mug. "What of your parents?" "They died when we were both younger. I was 18 then, Mary 12. "You raised her, took care of her until she was married?" Charlie guessed, and he glanced at her in surprise. "Aye. How did you know?" Charlie shrugged. "Who else would do it?" "You have mentioned no one else," she murmured absently, her thoughts on what she had learned. His guilt was because he had grown up taking care of his sister. He felt that he should have insisted more that they take his carriage. Mayhap he even thought that he should have accompanied them. He seemed to feel that he had failed them somehow. Such feelings were no doubt also behind his offering of protection to herself and her sister. After all, he had said himself that Beth reminded him of Mary. Last night must have seemed similar to him to the situation that had seen his sister's death. A man and a woman alone on the road, travelling at night. Aye, now she understood his offer to help them. Radcliffe frowned. He was likely irritated and embarrassed with himself for revealing so much. Charlie could sense that she had elicited from him information he hadn't offered anyone in years. Suddenly impatient, Radcliffe glared into his drink briefly, then glanced up. "Can you shoot? Or has no one taught you?" Charlie's hesitation was answer enough, and Radcliffe got to his feet. "No doubt your uncle wouldn't have bothered. Any man who would sell his niece to Carland would hardly be bothered with whether his nephew can defend himself." He gave Charlie a small smile. "Come along," he ordered gruffly. Scrambling from behind the table, Charlie hurried after him. "Where have you been?" Beth rushed forward as Charlie and Radcliffe entered the inn 2 hours later. Charlie caught the concern on her sister's face and grinned, but it was Radcliffe who answered. "I was teaching your brother to shoot." Beth's eyes widened incredulously. "Really? How did it go?" Charlie began to chuckle when Radcliffe hesitated. She knew that she was not exactly what one would call a natural. She had not hit a single target. Surprisingly, Radcliffe had not lost his patience with her ineptitude. He had been terribly encouraging, telling her when they finally gave up that she would improve with practice. Lots of practice. "What your brother lacks in accuracy, he makes up for in enthusiasm. He shall improve. He just needs practice," Radcliffe said finally, and Charlie's chuckles turned into all-out laughter at his attempt at diplomacy. When Radcliffe smiled faintly at her amusement, Charlie gave him a slightly mocking bow, then took Beth's arm and steered her toward the room they had dined in earlier, confiding cheerfully as they went. "I am a complete failure as a man, I fear. I could not hit the side of the inn at 10 paces. Beth blinked, then burst out laughing as they reached the table. Radcliffe followed the pair, smiling like a benign monarch on his charges. Taking a seat across from them, he listened, his smile growing as Charles relayed the events of the afternoon, realizing as he listened that rather than be discouraged, the boy had found it all a great adventure. The twins continued to chat during the meal, coaxing smiles from Radcliffe every so often. Then Beth excused herself and said she was going to rest. Radcliffe decided that the girl had a very delicate constitution if she must rest so often, but said nothing. Charlie, on the other hand, watched her sister go with a sigh. Beth expected her to wait until Radcliffe was asleep, steal his pistol, then go to her. But she was beginning to dislike the idea. Radcliffe was nice, and he had gone out of his way to help them. The idea of stealing his pistol, whether she left jewels in exchange for it or not, just did not sit well with her. She glanced down at her ale and grimaced. On the other hand, they had to get to Cousin Ralphie, and having heard how Radcliffe's sister had died, she absolutely would not set out without a weapon. The perils of the road were suddenly very believable. Pushing her ale away, Charlie stood and muttered that she had to tell Beth something, then hurried up to her sister's room. "I cannot steal his pistol," she announced, stepping inside and closing the door. "Good," Beth finished, stepping out of her gown and laid it across a chair by the bed, oblivious to Charlie's sudden frown. "What do you mean, good?" "He is nice," Beth announced firmly, releasing her hair to fall in long waves around her shoulders. "And it would be stealing, whether we left a bracelet or not." Sighing, Charlie sank onto the side of the bed. "I know. Now what do we do?" "You shall think of something," Beth said, complacently, and Charlie was suddenly angry. It had always been that way. Were they in trouble, and in need of a plan, Charlie was expected to come up with it and get them out of the hot water. Oddly enough, it had never bothered her before, but now it did. Before she could comment, Beth mused. "It is a shame that we are not in a town or something. We could simply buy one then." Charlie stared at her blankly for a moment, then suddenly smiled. "Good idea." Pausing in the act of crawling into bed, Beth glanced at her blankly. "What?" "I shall see if the innkeeper has a flintlock. He is sure to have one. I shall buy it off him." "What if he does not want to sell it?" Charlie shrugged and walked to the door. "I shall offer him so much that he will not be able to refuse." She paused, raising a hand to silence Beth, as she listened to footsteps come up the stairs. The door to the room she had shared with Radcliffe opened and closed, and Charlie smiled slightly. It meant that she could talk to the innkeeper without worrying that Radcliffe might overhear. "Wake me if he sells it to you," Beth whispered as Charlie opened the door. Nodding, she closed the door behind her and headed below. Chapter 3. The innkeeper was a burly, rough-voiced man. Charlie took a seat at a table, accepted the ale the man brought over, then sipped at it as she considered how to approach him on the subject of a pistol. After a moment, she glanced about the room, empty but for her and the keeper, and waved him over. "Is there something else you'd like, my lord?" "Company, if you do not mind, sir." Have a seat." Eyes widening, the keeper hesitated a moment, then went to fetch a fresh pitcher and mug for himself. Returning, he took a seat across from Charlie, refilled her drink, then poured himself one, and they drank in companionable silence for a while. "I hear it can be dangerous on the roads," she commented, finally. "Aye," the innkeeper nodded solemnly. "I wouldn't worry none, though, me lord. What with his lordship with ye? He handles hisself well." Charlie nodded. "He was teaching me to shoot today." The innkeeper grinned. He had seen the two of them out in the field. "You'll learn," he said sympathetically. Charlie glanced up, then smiled wryly. "Aye." Leaning forward, the innkeeper refilled her drink, and Charlie glanced down in surprise. She had not realized that she had been drinking so quickly. Determining to slow down her consumption, she asked, "Have you got a pistol?" "Oh, aye. A fine piece, my lord. Care to see it?" Charlie nodded eagerly, and the barrel-chested man manoeuvred himself out from behind the table and hurried from the room. Charlie sipped at her drink as she waited, perking up when the man returned, pistol in hand. "There." He set the flintlock pistol on the table with care, and then poured more ale for them both as Charlie picked up the weapon. It seemed a fine piece, 13 inches long with cut steel stock inlays. Her eyes widened as she noted the initials R.N. on the hand-carved stock, guessing correctly that an innkeeper would not be able to afford such a fine piece. "Got it from a lord," he announced, noting her interest in the initials. "Couldn't pay his bill. Got caught up in a game of chance with some other customers at the inn. Lost all his money. Caught him trying to sneak out in the middle of the night. He gave me the pistol, rather than find himself arrested. Bad business, that. Sneaking out of an inn in the middle of the night." Charlie nearly overturned her drink at those words and glanced up sharply to find Radcliffe standing over her, laughter in his eyes. "I thought you had gone to bed, my lord," she commented irritably, shifting on her seat and handing the innkeeper the pistol back. "We slept all day," Radcliffe pointed out, taking a seat at the table and waving the innkeeper back to his when he started to rise. "Do not leave on my account. I thought to join you both." "I'll just get ye a glass, your lordship," the innkeeper said happily, hurrying away from the table. Charlie watched him go with a sigh. The man was overjoyed at this turn of events. It was not often, she supposed, that two members of the gentry sat to drink with him. It was a shame she could not share in his pleasure, but right that minute Charlie wished Radcliffe anywhere but there. "It is less than a day's travel to London from the next inn we shall stop at." Charlie glanced at Radcliffe as he continued. "I am going to send a messenger on from there to fetch my hack. It is enclosed, and I think it would be better if you and your sister are not seen arriving. You can stay at my townhouse, and I shall introduce you as my cousins. That should give you a little bit of time before the lie is discovered, and your uncle finds out your whereabouts. With any luck, we shall have her married off before then." He was silent for a moment, then went on with his plans for them. "I shall take you to a jeweller I know the day after we arrive. He will give you a fair price for your mother's jewels. I would not recommend cashing them all in right away, though. Just enough to pay for wardrobes, and make a few investments should do. I was heading to town myself to invest in a venture. You might want to consider it. It is a bit risky, but if all goes well, it might be very profitable." Charlie merely sat blinking at the man, a little stunned at all he was saying. He was offering a lot more than protection, and what he was offering was astounding. His home, protection, and aid. With his help she could build a fortune and marry Beth off to a nice safe man that she liked. If she really were Charles, and not Charlie. She reminded herself and sighed. Of the two of them, Beth was not the one who was really in peril. She would have been miserable married to Seguin, but she would have been well cared for. The real danger was to Charlie herself, and she could hardly find a husband as a man. Sighing, she shook her head regretfully. It had been a nice thought, but she could not risk Beth having a coming out, even with a fake name. Their safest option was to flee to Ralphie. That in mind, she determined to wait until Radcliffe went to bed, then to approach the innkeeper about his gun. "The boy seems a bit under the weather, my lord," the innkeeper commented with amusement. Not used to strong drink, I'd be saying. Radcliffe glanced at Charlie's rather blank expression and smiled wryly. And I would say you were right, he agreed dryly, reaching out quickly to catch the boy by the scruff of the neck when he suddenly lurched forward in his seat with every appearance of being about to slam face first into the tabletop. He's done gone and passed out, the innkeeper laughed. Aye. Sighing, Radcliffe straightened, still holding the boy's head up, then lifted him in his arms. A skinny little fella, isn't he? The innkeeper commented, glancing over the boy lying limply in the man's arms. Looks a lot like his sister. Acts a lot like her too. He'll be a fine man once he's grown, though. Aye. Radcliffe headed for the stairs. There will be extra coin when I pay tomorrow. Thank you for your company. And the ale. You're welcome, my lord. My pleasure. Radcliffe carried Charles up to their room, glancing curiously at the boy's face as he moved. The resemblance between the twins was rather amazing, and now that the innkeeper had mentioned it, they did act a lot alike. The boy could be almost missish on occasion. It was probably from spending so much time in Beth's company, he supposed, rearranging the boy in his arms to open the door to their room. He would shed those ways easily after some time in male company, no doubt. It had become obvious from conversation at dinner that the brother and sister spent most, if not all, of their time together. That was unsurprising when the only other kin around was their uncle. Kicking the door closed with one booted foot, Radcliffe walked to the bed and set the boy gently upon it, aware of an odd sense of relief as he did. He did not feel at all comfortable touching the lad. He had noticed it that afternoon while teaching him to shoot. An odd sense of awareness had fired through him at one point when he had positioned himself behind the boy, one hand on his shoulder, the other on his hand to help him aim. His mind now shied away from the memory, just as he had physically removed himself from the nearness to Charles at the time. Radcliffe had a healthy sexual drive and had taken many women to his bed, or theirs as the case had been. He really was quite taken aback by his reaction to this slim young lad. It was probably the boy's resemblance to his sister, he decided suddenly, relieved at the simple explanation. It had been 2 weeks since he had broken off with his latest mistress. No doubt his abstinence of late, plus the boy's amazing resemblance to his sister, had caused a confused reaction inside him. The convoluted explanation made perfect sense to him, despite the fact that he had not noticed